2,000 horses versus panzers, the last great cavalry charge at the Battle of Moscow. On November 17, 1941, approximately 2,000 Soviet cavalrymen on horseback, sabers raised, bent low over their manes, charged directly into German artillery positions near a frozen Russian village. In 15 minutes, virtually every one of them was dead. Not a single German was killed. This wasn't medieval warfare accidentally stumbling into the modern age. This was a calculated military decision made by Soviet commanders who knew exactly what tanks and artillery could do to horses and men. And the truly insane part? They did it twice. Same field, same result, within the same hour. How does a military commander in 1941, after watching Poland fall in weeks, France collapse in days, and seeing what mechanized warfare actually means, order cavalry charges with sabers against entrenched artillery? This wasn't ignorance. Soviet commanders had studied blitzkrieg. They'd seen what happened to their own tank divisions. They knew the numbers. Yet 2 full regiments of mounted cavalry were sent galloping across open snow toward German machine gun nests and artillery pieces that had the entire field pre-sighted. The order came from the top. The men obeyed, and within minutes, a military tactic that dominated warfare for 3,000 years died in the Russian snow. This is the story of the absolute last moment when cavalry warfare, the backbone of military power from ancient Assyria through Napoleon, met 20th century firepower and was obliterated. But here's what nobody tells you. It wasn't pointless. The Soviet Union was 3 weeks away from losing Moscow, which would have likely meant losing the entire war. And in that moment of absolute desperation, with panzer divisions 22 miles from the Kremlin, commanders made a calculation. They traded 2,000 lives for 15 minutes of distraction. The question isn't whether it was barbaric. The question is whether it worked. The date matters. November 17, 1941. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union exactly 148 days earlier, with the largest invasion force in human history. 3.6 million men, 3,350 tanks, 7,200 artillery pieces, and 2,670 aircraft. The plan, Operation Barbarossa, gave them 4 months to reach Moscow. They'd already conquered Poland in 28 days and France in 46. The Wehrmacht genuinely believed, based on extremely solid evidence, that the Soviet Union would collapse by October. Hitler himself had already ordered the printing of occupation currency. German officers carried maps showing their victory parade routes through Red Square. This wasn't arrogance. This was reasonable confidence based on performance. But October came and went. The Wehrmacht was now stuck outside Moscow in November, the worst month in Russian military history to be stuck anywhere. Temperatures had already dropped to -15 Celsius. Soldiers were freezing to death at their posts. Supply lines stretched back 1,000 miles through mud that swallowed trucks whole. Tank engines wouldn't start. Weapons jammed. Horses, yes, the Germans relied heavily on horses too, were dying by the thousands. The German word that appears in every diary from this period is Schlamm period, the mud period. Vehicles couldn't move. Infantry marched in freezing slush that turned their boots into blocks of ice. And yet, the panzers kept grinding forward because Moscow was right there. German reconnaissance units could literally see the Kremlin towers through binoculars. Here's the number that explains Soviet desperation. By early November, the Red Army had lost 2.8 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured since June. That's not a typo. Nearly 3 million casualties in less than 5 months. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. At Vyazma, just weeks earlier, 660,000 Soviet troops were trapped in a single pocket. The Wehrmacht was capturing Soviet soldiers faster than they could process them as prisoners. Stalin had already evacuated most of the government to Kuibyshev, 500 miles east. Lenin's embalmed body was removed from Red Square and shipped east for safekeeping. Factory equipment was being dismantled and loaded onto trains headed to the Urals. Moscow's metro stations were packed with civilians sheltering from Luftwaffe bombing raids. Barricades went up across major streets. Women and teenagers dug anti-tank ditches around the city. 3 million cubic meters of frozen earth moved by hand. The NKVD had orders to blow the bridges and prepare for house-to-house fighting. Every single indicator suggested Moscow would fall within days. And if Moscow fell, most historians agree, the Soviet Union would have collapsed. But Stalin made a decision that changed everything. On November 7th, with German artillery clearly audible in the Kremlin, he held the traditional Revolution Day parade in Red Square. Troops marched past Lenin's tomb, newly empty, and then marched directly to the front lines, which were less than 70 miles away. The message was unmistakable. We're not leaving. And behind that propaganda moment was an equally crucial military decision. Stalin and his new commander, Georgy Zhukov, were pulling every available unit from across the Soviet Union to defend Moscow. That included cavalry divisions from Siberia and Mongolia. And this is where our story actually begins, because one of those cavalry divisions was the 44th Mongolian Cavalry Division, which had just arrived at the front with approximately 3,000 mounted troops who still fought like their ancestors had fought on the steppes for 1,000 years. The 44th Mongolian Cavalry Division wasn't a historical reenactment unit that accidentally wandered into World War II. These were trained soldiers, part of the Red Army's deliberate cavalry expansion. When Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet Union had only 13 cavalry divisions. By December 1941, they would expand to 82 cavalry divisions because of one simple, brutal fact. Germany had destroyed the Soviet mechanized forces so completely that cavalry, which needed only hay and could move through forests where tanks couldn't, became the only mobile force available. Each standard Soviet cavalry division was authorized 8,968 men and 7,625 horses, plus some light tanks and artillery. But the 44th was different. It was designated a mountain cavalry division, made up primarily of Mongolian troops who'd spent their entire lives on horseback and had served previously against Japanese forces in 1939. These weren't ceremonial cavalry. They were shock troops, trained to ride to battle positions, dismount, and fight as infantry with machine guns and mortars. But they also retained one capability that made them unique: the mounted cavalry charge. Not because it was effective against modern weapons, everyone knew it wasn't, but because in specific circumstances, rapid cavalry movement through terrain impassable to vehicles could achieve objectives that mechanized units couldn't. Soviet cavalry doctrine explicitly stated that mounted charges were only to be used for surprise attacks through forests or against rear areas. Never against prepared positions, never across open ground, never against artillery. On November 17th, 1941, the 44th Mongolian Cavalry Division received orders that violated every principle of cavalry doctrine. Attack the German 106th Infantry Division entrenched near the village of Musino. Not probe their flanks, not infiltrate through the forests, attack frontally across open fields. The German 106th held a critical position between Volokolamsk and Klin, two towns that formed part of the defensive arc around Moscow's northwestern approaches. If the Germans broke through here, they'd have a direct route to the Moscow-Leningrad Railway, which would split Soviet defenses in half. So the order was desperate, but it had military logic. Disrupt the German position long enough for Soviet rifle divisions to establish defensive lines, even if the cavalry was destroyed by time. But here's what makes this truly incomprehensible. The 44th Cavalry Division didn't make one charge, they made two. And the 2nd Regiment watched the 1st Regiment get annihilated before they received their orders to charge across the same field. Let that sink in. The first wave, approximately 1,000 horsemen from the 1st Mounted Regiment, formed up at the forest edge. German forward observers spotted them immediately. The 107th Artillery Regiment, attached to the 106th Infantry Division, had already zeroed in the entire approach field. This is critical. The Germans knew exactly where cavalry would emerge from the forest. They'd calculated the range. They'd preset their guns. The Soviet cavalry might as well have been charging into a firing range. The charge began at dawn. Imagine the scene. A wall of cavalry emerging from the tree line, horses at full gallop, plumes of snow exploding from their hooves, cavalrymen bent low with sabers extended. For about 15 seconds, it would have looked magnificent, like something from the Napoleonic Wars, painted by a romantic artist. Then the German artillery opened fire. Not machine guns, not rifles, artillery. The 107th Artillery Regiment fired over open sights, meaning they could see their targets directly. Salvos of 76 Semmond and 122mm shells started exploding in the packed cavalry formation while they were still 600 meters away. A single shell could kill or wound a dozen horses and riders. The historical accounts describe horses and men literally being blown apart mid-stride. Limbs separated from bodies, horses collapsed, throwing riders who were then trampled by the horses behind them. The cavalry tried to maintain formation. This is what their training demanded. But cavalry formations are designed for shock impact against infantry lines, not for crossing killing fields under artillery fire. The horses panicked. Some turned back. Some kept running but without riders. The few that made it through the initial artillery barrage ran into machine gun fire from German positions 200 meters away. Heavy machine guns firing at 500 rounds per minute into a wall of horses and men. The mathematics are simple and horrifying. Within 10 minutes, the 1st Mounted Regiment ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Out of approximately 1,000 men who charged, historical records indicate that only 30 horsemen reached the German positions. Not one German soldier was killed or wounded. Now here's the part that defies comprehension. The 2nd Mounted Regiment, having just witnessed the complete destruction of the 1st Regiment, received orders to charge. Same field, same German positions, same artillery that was now even better calibrated because they'd just had live fire practice. There are several theories about why this order was given. The most charitable interpretation is that Soviet commanders believed the German guns might have exhausted their ammunition, or that the shock of seeing a second wave would break German morale. The most cynical interpretation is that the regimental commander had already ordered both regiments to attack and couldn't or wouldn't countermand the order even after seeing the catastrophic failure of the first charge. The most likely interpretation is that Soviet military doctrine in 1941 assumed that orders from superiors were correct and that failure simply meant insufficient effort. The 2nd Regiment charged. Same result, but somehow worse because everyone involved knew exactly what was about to happen. The German artillery crews didn't even have to adjust their aim. They just resumed firing at preset coordinates. The second wave lasted approximately 12 minutes. By the time the attack was called off, approximately 2,000 Soviet cavalrymen were dead or dying in the snow. Casualty reports for horses are actually more detailed than human casualties. 1,330 horses killed, 1,471 missing. The human toll from Soviet archives shows 282 confirmed dead and 1,459 missing for the 44th Cavalry Division in this period. But missing in this context almost certainly means dead, because there was no Soviet retreat from the field. Everyone either died in the charge or made it back to Soviet lines. German after-action reports from the 107th Artillery Regiment described the scene with clinical detachment. The field was carpeted with dead horses and men. Some horses, wounded but not dead, tried to stand and kept collapsing. Soviet wounded who couldn't retreat froze to death where they fell, because both sides had withdrawn. and the no-man's land between positions was under continuous fire. The temperature that night dropped to -13°C. Within hours, the bodies and the blood froze into the landscape. German reconnaissance photos taken the next day showed dark shapes scattered across white snow like seeds spilled on paper. Those dark shapes were cavalrymen and horses frozen in the positions where they died. Why did it happen? That's the question that historians have debated for 8 decades. The easy answer, that Soviet commanders were incompetent or that Stalin's purges had killed all the good officers, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Many Soviet commanders at Moscow were highly competent and would go on to win major victories later in the war. The real answer is more complex and more disturbing. This was the calculated price of buying time. The 44th Cavalry Division's charge, despite its catastrophic failure, did accomplish one thing. It convinced German commanders that the Soviets had enough reserves to conduct large-scale attacks, even suicidal ones. This contributed to a German assessment that the Soviets were not on the verge of collapse, which influenced decisions about whether to commit final reserves to one last push toward Moscow. But let's be honest about what that means. Soviet commanders traded 2,000 lives for a psychological effect. They turned men into ammunition. They calculated that the shock value of cavalry charges, even failed ones, might buy hours or days. And in the context of Moscow in November 1941, hours mattered. Every hour that German forces spent dealing with Soviet attacks, even futile ones, was an hour they weren't advancing toward Moscow. Every day that passed made German logistics worse, made the weather colder, made defensive lines stronger. The cynical calculus of total war, 2,000 cavalry deaths might save 200,000 civilian lives if it helped hold Moscow. And here's what almost nobody knows. The cavalry charge at Musino wasn't even the most important cavalry action at the Battle of Moscow. 9 days later, on November 26th, another Soviet cavalry force, General Pavel Belov's 2nd Cavalry Corps, later renamed 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, stopped German panzers near Kashira, 80 miles south of Moscow. But Belov didn't order charges across open fields. He used cavalry as mobile-mounted infantry, supported by tanks, artillery, and Katyusha rocket launchers. Belov's force actually worked. They drove Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army back 40 kilometers. Same cavalry units, completely different tactics, completely different result, which proves that the Musino charge wasn't about cavalry being obsolete. It was about using cavalry in ways that guaranteed failure. The Battle of Moscow turned on dozens of factors. The weather, German overextension, Soviet reserves from Siberia, brilliant defensive planning by Zhukov, Hitler's interference with his generals, and pure, stubborn determination by Soviet forces to hold at all costs. The cavalry charge at Musino was a footnote, barely mentioned in most histories of the battle. But it represents something significant: the absolute end of cavalry as a primary combat arm. After World War II, every major army in the world retired its cavalry divisions. Not gradually. Within months of the war ending, cavalry units were disbanded or converted to mechanized infantry. The last cavalry charge had proven what everyone already knew, but hadn't quite accepted. The age of the horse soldier was over. But there's a twist. Cavalry wasn't retired because it was ineffective. Soviet cavalry remained active throughout the war and achieved significant successes when properly employed. Between July and December 1941, Soviet cavalry expanded from 13 to 82 divisions precisely because cavalry worked when used correctly. Cavalry could operate where tanks couldn't, needed minimal supply lines, could conduct raids deep behind enemy lines, and provided mobile firepower on battlefields where mechanized units had been destroyed. The problem wasn't cavalry. The problem was commanders who ordered 19th century tactics against 20th century weapons. The 44th Mongolian Cavalry Division was rebuilt after Musino. Not immediately, it took months. Many of the survivors were reassigned to other units. The divisional number was eventually merged into the 17th Cavalry Division in 1942. But Mongolian cavalry units continued fighting throughout the war, and in 1945, Mongolian cavalry participated in the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, where they finally faced an enemy, Imperial Japanese forces in China, against whom cavalry tactics were still occasionally effective. Some of those cavalrymen who fought in Manchuria in 1945 might have been survivors of Musino in 1941, though records don't confirm this. Paul Carrel's Hitler Moves East, published in 1964, made the Musino charge famous in the West. Carrel, real name Paul Carl Schmidt, was a Nazi propagandist during the war, which complicates his reliability. His account emphasizes German military prowess and Soviet incompetence, fitting his agenda of rehabilitating Wehrmacht reputation. But here's the problem. His basic facts about Musino check out. Soviet archives confirm the charge happened, confirm the date, confirm the catastrophic casualties. German military records from the 106th Infantry Division and 107th Artillery Regiment match his account. The charge happened. The question is what it meant. Modern military historians view Musino as a case study in what happens when doctrine lags behind technology. Every army in history has had moments where tactics that worked in the last war failed catastrophically in the current war. The British learned this at the Somme in 1916. The French learned it in 1940. The Soviets learned it at Musino. The difference is that by 1941, everyone theoretically knew that massed cavalry charges against prepared positions were suicide. It shouldn't have required another demonstration, yet it did, because knowing something theoretically and accepting it viscerally are different things. Some lessons have to be written in blood before they're truly learned. There's a broader point here about why the Soviets won the Battle of Moscow, despite catastrophic mistakes like Musino. The Soviet system, brutal as it was, had one overwhelming advantage: depth. Stalin could accept losses that would have ended any other nation's ability to fight. The Soviet Union lost more soldiers in the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa than the United States lost in the entire war across all theaters. Yet Soviet forces kept fighting, kept retreating, kept reforming, kept counterattacking. The charge at Musino killed 2,000 men, but the Soviet Union conscripted 34.4 million people during the war. Those 2,000 deaths were a rounding error in the overall casualty statistics. That's not meant to diminish the tragedy. Each of those 2,000 men had families, had lives, had futures that ended in a frozen field outside Moscow. But strategically, the Soviet system could absorb losses that would have broken Germany. By early December 1941, the German offensive at Moscow had stalled. Not because of any single Soviet victory, but because of cumulative exhaustion. The Wehrmacht had pushed to within 22 miles of the Kremlin, but couldn't go farther. German soldiers could see Moscow's buildings, but couldn't reach them. On December 5th, Zhukov launched the Soviet counteroffensive using fresh Siberian divisions that had been held in reserve. These weren't desperate cavalry charges. These were coordinated combined arms attacks with infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support. The Soviets drove German forces back 100 to 250 kilometers over the next 2 months. The immediate threat to Moscow ended. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility died, and somewhere in that bigger story is the charge at Musino. 2,000 horses and men charging artillery positions, dying in minutes, accomplishing nothing tangible, but maybe accomplishing something intangible, demonstrating to both sides that the Soviet Union would throw everything, even obsolete cavalry with sabers, into the defense of Moscow. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that was the message. Or maybe it was just a catastrophic command failure that happened to occur at the most important battle of the Eastern Front. History doesn't always have clear moral lessons. Sometimes it just has events that happened and people who died. The cavalry charge as a military tactic survived for roughly 5,000 years, from the first domestication of horses through the battlefields of World War I. There were cavalry charges at Waterloo in 1815 and cavalry charges on the Eastern Front in 1914. Cavalry remained militarily relevant into the 1930s, but somewhere between 1918 and 1945, the mathematics changed. Machine guns, barbed wire, artillery, tanks, and aircraft made mounted cavalry obsolete for offensive operations. The last gasps of cavalry warfare occurred in World War II, mostly on the Eastern Front, where terrain and Soviet desperation made cavalry temporarily useful. But Musino represents the absolute endpoint, the moment when cavalry charged modern firepower and was erased. What makes Musino particularly poignant is that it wasn't necessary. If the 44th Cavalry Division had been deployed as mobile mounted infantry, using horses for transportation, but fighting dismounted with machine guns and mortars, they might have achieved the objective without catastrophic losses. This is exactly how other Soviet cavalry units fought successfully at Moscow. The decision to order a mounted charge, sabers drawn, horses at full gallop, was anachronistic even by 1941 standards. It was a tactic from a war 50 years in the past applied to a war that had moved on. Here's what cavalry represented: speed, mobility, shock, and tactical flexibility. For most of human history, cavalry was the decisive arm. Infantry held ground. Artillery bombarded positions, but cavalry won battles through rapid movement and shock impact. A cavalry charge could break enemy lines, exploit breakthroughs, pursue routing enemies, and turn tactical victories into strategic triumphs. From Alexander the Great through Napoleon, cavalry dominated warfare. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, weapons that could kill horses faster than they could charge. The machine gun ended cavalry's dominance. World War I proved it. Yet cavalry persisted because military traditions die slowly and because cavalry still had utility in reconnaissance, screening, and rapid exploitation. The Soviet Union's massive cavalry expansion in 1941 wasn't foolish. It was pragmatic adaptation to circumstances. With most of their tanks destroyed, the Soviets needed mobile forces. Cavalry could be raised quickly from populations that knew how to ride, required minimal industrial resources, and could operate in terrain and weather that stopped vehicles. Soviet cavalry doctrine emphasized using horses for mobility, but fighting as infantry. The charges at Musino violated that doctrine. They represented either desperation so complete that doctrine didn't matter, or command failure so severe that proper tactics were ignored. The legacy of Musino is complicated. In the West, it became a symbol of Soviet incompetence and wastefulness with human life, which fit Cold War narratives perfectly. In Russia, it's barely mentioned in official histories, because it doesn't fit the narrative of brilliant Soviet military strategy defeating Nazi aggression. The truth, as always, is more nuanced. The Soviet defense of Moscow succeeded not because every decision was brilliant, but because even catastrophic failures like Musino couldn't break Soviet determination to hold. The Soviet system accepted losses that democratic societies couldn't accept. Whether that makes the Soviet victory more or less admirable is a question each person has to answer for themselves. But let's end with the men who charged. 2,000 cavalrymen, mostly Mongolians in their 20s, raised on horses on the Asian steppes, who'd trained for war and been told they were defending civilization against fascism. They didn't choose to charge artillery positions. They followed orders, as soldiers do. They rode into that field, knowing their odds were poor, but probably not knowing they were riding into certain death. Military history tends to abstract away individual experience into unit designations and casualty statistics. But every one of those 2,000 men experienced their own terror, their own pain, their own death. The field at Musino became their grave, and within hours they were frozen into the landscape, forgotten by history except as a footnote about the last cavalry charge. The Battle of Moscow raged for 2 more months after Musino. By January 1942, Soviet forces had pushed German armies back from the capital. Moscow was saved. The Soviet Union survived. And from that survival came the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The strategic situation in November 1941 was so desperate that Soviet commanders believed they needed to use every available unit, even cavalry, even in ways that guaranteed heavy losses. The charge at Musino failed tactically, but maybe succeeded strategically by buying time and demonstrating Soviet willingness to fight to the last man. Was it worth it? That's not a question history can answer. The cavalrymen who died at Musino helped defend Moscow through their sacrifice. But they might have helped more if they'd been deployed differently. Their deaths didn't change the outcome of the battle, but their willingness to charge into certain death reflected the determination that ultimately saved Moscow. The Soviet Union won the Battle of Moscow through a combination of military skill, strategic depth, weather, German mistakes, and sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. The cavalry charge at Musino embodied that last quality. Stubborn refusal to quit, even when refusal meant riding horses with sabers against artillery and dying in minutes. The field at Musino is still there, now part of modern Russia. There's no monument to the 2,000 cavalrymen who died there. Most Russians don't know the charge happened. The village itself has faded into obscurity. But on November 17, 1941, that frozen field witnessed the end of something that had shaped human warfare for millennia. The age of cavalry ended not with a glorious final charge that somehow succeeded against impossible odds, but with a charge that failed exactly as modern military theory predicted it would fail. 2,000 men and horses dead in 15 minutes, 0 German casualties, one of history's most one-sided battles, and the absolute last time any army would order cavalry with sabers to charge prepared defensive positions. That's what happened at Musino on November 17, 1941. Not a last stand, not a heroic sacrifice that changed the war. Just a military disaster that occurred during the defense of Moscow and demonstrated, beyond any remaining doubt, that cavalry warfare had no future against modern firepower. The men who died there deserved better tactics, better strategy, better leadership. They got none of those things. They got orders to charge, and they obeyed, and they died, and history mostly forgot them. But their charge marked the end of an era. After Musino, no army ever again sent cavalry charging with sabers into modern defenses. The lesson was finally, completely, bloodily learned.